The courtroom was packed. The bright lights reflected off the star lawyer's expensive suit, and every move he made seemed rehearsed for the cameras and journalists in the front row. I walked in silently, wearing my worn-out suit, the one I bought in installments after months of saving. That's when he saw me. He smirked, as if he'd just spotted the punchline to a joke, and fired, "Are you lost, little girl?" Laughter echoed through the courtroom. Some whispered, others laughed openly. The judge said nothing, as if it were all just part of the show. I didn't respond. I walked to my table, sat down, and calmly wrote in the corner of a page the exact time when he called me a lost little girl. Inside, my blood was boiling. It wasn't the first time someone tried to belittle me. I knew that bitter taste well. But on the outside, I kept my face cold. To anyone watching, I was just a quiet young woman, maybe even intimidated. The truth, I was only waiting. He thought he had already won with a single joke. Little did he know that in that very minute, I had marked the beginning of his downfall. I never had a room of my own. I slept on a thin mattress in the damp basement of the house, sharing space with my younger sister. When it rained, we scattered buckets to catch the water dripping from the ceiling. My mother came home from cleaning houses with the smell of disinfectant stuck to her hands. My father, when lucky, found odd jobs carrying boxes in warehouses. When not, the air was filled only with silence and frustration. I went to school with borrowed books and torn backpacks. I once used a plastic bag as a school bag. I heard jokes about it. Some teachers said that no one from there would ever become a lawyer, doctor, or judge. I didn't reply, but I wrote down every word. Many nights I studied by candlelight because the power had been cut. Many times I had stale bread with watered-down coffee for dinner. Even so, I never missed an exam. At 10 years old, I overheard a neighbor tell my mother, "People like you never win in court." That sentence carved itself into me. That was the moment my dream of becoming a lawyer was born. I had no luxury, no last name, no contacts, only filled notebooks, attentive eyes, and a silent rage. And every humiliation of my childhood became ammunition. One day, I promised myself, I will step into a courtroom, and no one will ever laugh at me again. I learned early that nothing would come for free. While many of my classmates went home to rest, I went straight to work. My first job was at a fast food restaurant. The uniform always smelled of grease, and when I came home at night, so did my hair. Some customers called me sweetheart, as if I were an object. Others treated me as if I were invisible. When they found out I was studying law, they laughed. They said, "A waitress wanting to be a lawyer? Good luck, honey." Those words no longer hurt me. They only became fuel. Between trays, I carried in my mind the list of books I still wanted to buy. I counted the tip coins hidden in the wardrobe of my improvised room, always thinking, just 2 more days of work and I can buy that used civil code. When I wasn't at the restaurant, I cleaned offices. Funny thing, I wiped desks where lawyers left open case files, scribbles, contracts. Sometimes I secretly read passages, afraid of being caught. It was like touching a piece of a future that wasn't mine yet. On the crowded bus ride home, I studied standing up. I memorized articles, jurisprudence, and scribbled summaries in worn-out notebooks. While others slept, I turned every minute into rehearsal for the future. There were nights when my body begged for rest. But the memory of the neighbor saying, "People like us never win in court," kept me awake. I wanted to prove him wrong, not just for me, but for my mother, who came home with swollen knees from scrubbing other people's floors, for my father, who avoided looking us in the eyes when the rent was overdue, for my sister, who believed in me like one believes in a miracle. In my senior year of high school, when I told a teacher I wanted to study law, he laughed. "You? Maybe you'll manage to work as a secretary in some office, but a lawyer? That world isn't for you." I thanked him, smiled politely, and wrote his exact words in my notebook. I still keep that page to this day. I cried secretly at night, it's true. The feeling of always being the joke, always the pitiful dreamer, weighed on me. But each tear was swallowed with the same promise. I would not stop. The day I received the letter confirming my full scholarship to law school, I cried like a child. There was no party at home, No champagne like the rich families had for their children's admissions. There was only my mother, who hugged me with her rough hands and said, "I never had the chance to study, but you are going to change our story." In that embrace, I understood. My victory would never be mine alone. And it was there that the waitress, the cleaning lady, the invisible daughter of a forgotten neighborhood, began to transform into the lawyer who would one day stand on the same ground as those who once mocked her. They didn't know. But every tray carried, every desk wiped, every sleepless night was the brick of my future revenge. Getting into law school felt like crossing an invisible gate that kept whispering, "You don't belong here." I was admitted on a full scholarship, but no scholarship could cover the inequality stamped on every detail. While my classmates parked imported cars in front of the building, I arrived with wind-tousled hair after 2 hours on crowded buses. They wore designer clothes and expensive perfumes. I rotated between the same 2 thrift store suits, praying no one would notice. The first weeks were a shock. The hallways reeked of privilege. Conversations about trips to Europe, internships in family-owned law firms, surnames that opened doors before graduation. I was the odd one out at the party. When I spoke, some classmates laughed at my accent. Others looked at me like an intruder trespassing in their private garden. But the worst wasn't the students. It was some of the professors. One of them, famous for publishing books on constitutional law, called me aside after class. With a cold smile, he said, "You're hardworking, but you should be more realistic. This course is meant to form leaders. Maybe your path is somewhere else." I thanked him, left the room with my throat tight, and wrote his entire sentence in my notebook. Another scar for the collection. Studying was a daily war. I couldn't afford new books, so I spent hours in the library, copying passages by hand because I couldn't even pay for photocopies. I lived on instant coffee and stale bread. Many times I slept right there, slumped against a pile of books because I couldn't afford late-night transportation home. While some classmates gathered in study groups with wine and cheese, I reviewed jurisprudence alone, surrounded by silence and fluorescent lights. Every page I read was another brick in the wall between who I was and who I wanted to become. Working and studying at the same time was exhausting. I would leave an 8-hour shift at the fast food place and go straight to class. I arrived with the smell of frying oil clinging to the uniform hidden beneath my cheap blazer. Some classmates wrinkled their noses. I pretended not to notice. There were nights when I thought about quitting, when my body screamed for rest, when the mountain of debt seemed bigger than my dreams. But then I remembered my mother on her knees scrubbing someone else's floor. I remembered the phrase I'd heard as a child, "People like you never win in court." It felt like a knife, but I turned it into a sword. By my 3rd year, I began to stand out. Professors who once ignored my questions started noticing I was the only one actually reading the case law. During an oral exam, a professor tried to trip me up with a rare article. I recited it word for word from memory. He fell silent, and my classmates, who had always laughed, could only stare in surprise. It wasn't recognition, it was fear. They realized that the poor waitress, the pitiful dreamer, had sharp teeth. Deep down, I knew. Every look of disdain, every muffled laugh, every professor who tried to belittle me, they were all digging their own graves. Because one day, I wouldn't just be the poor student. I would be the lawyer who buried giants. And when that day came, no one would laugh. My first internship in a law firm should have been a dream come true. I walked in full of excitement, clutching my folder, my heart pounding with expectation. After so much scrubbing floors and serving tables, I was finally inside a place that breathed the future I wanted. The office was beautiful, lined with shelves of gold-spined books I had only seen in expensive store windows. The smell was of fine coffee and polished leather, nothing like the old library back at school. I believed that from that moment on, my life would begin to change. But the illusion didn't last long. On the very first day, while I was organizing some old case files, one of the senior lawyers walked into the meeting room. I was there to learn, to observe. Before even asking who I was, he pointed to the table and said, "Can you bring us some coffee? 3 sugars in mine, please." I froze. I looked at him, then at the other lawyers settling into the leather chairs, and realized no one assumed I was an intern. To them, I was just support staff, closer to a maid than a future lawyer. With my face burning in shame, I went to the kitchen and prepared the coffee. When I set the tray on the table, he smiled and said, "See? With that attitude, you'll go far. Don't forget humility is essential in this profession." I smiled back without answering. Inside, my stomach churned. That wasn't humility. It was humiliation. I hadn't walked in there to serve coffee, but I quickly realized that to them, my place would never be beside them. It would always be behind them, carrying the tray. That episode repeated itself many times. Sometimes they asked me to make copies as if I were a secretary. Other times to organize office supplies. Once, while I tried to follow a meeting, a lawyer cut me off and said, "You look more like a maid than a jurist. Don't meddle in serious conversations." The laughter that echoed through that room stayed with me for days. I went home destroyed, but not broken. I looked in the mirror and repeated, "You weren't born to serve coffee. You were born to serve justice." Every copy made, every coffee served, every joke swallowed, I turned them all into fuel. I wrote down every detail in my diary. Dates, phrases, expressions. Not as a victim, but as a collector of ammunition. I knew that sooner or later, these same people who treated me as invisible would have to listen to me. At the time, I couldn't imagine that one day I would face a famous lawyer in a packed courtroom, being called a lost little girl. But when that moment came, I already had a whole history of scars to keep me standing tall. It was there, in that first internship, that I learned the difference between humiliation and teaching. They thought they were breaking me down, but in truth, they were forging me. And I made myself a promise. The next time I was asked to serve something at a courtroom table, it wouldn't be coffee. It would be defeat. After that internship, I could have quit. Many in my place would have quit. It was exhausting to always be the joke, to be treated as if I were trespassing on a space that didn't belong to me. Every time they called me to serve coffee, every time they laughed at my accent or my worn-out suit, it was as if the whole world shouted at me, "Go back to your place." But the truth is, I never had a place to go back to. The only place I recognized as mine was the future I hadn't conquered yet. So, I kept going. I started working double. Mornings at the internship, afternoons in a small office that barely paid, and nights at law school. I came home exhausted with aching feet, but instead of sleeping, I opened my notebooks. I studied deep into the night, fueled by cheap coffee and heavy eyes, until the sun rose and it was time to start again. My mother said I would kill myself from so much effort. I answered that I had already spent too long dying slowly, being invisible. Now it was time to live as someone who builds. The years passed, and little by little I gained the respect of some professors. Not because anyone gave me credit for free, but because I didn't make mistakes. I refused to. When they asked about difficult articles, I knew them by heart. When they wanted analysis, I had already read case law no one else bothered to. They began to realize that the waitress pretending to dream was, in fact, the only one truly prepared. Still, prejudice never disappeared. A criminal law professor, famous for training students for bar exams, once told me, "You're smart, but do you really have the profile to be a lawyer? You know, it's a competitive, tough environment. Maybe a public servant role would suit you better." I swallowed hard. Profile to be a lawyer. He didn't know it, but every time someone doubted me, it only made me more certain that I was on the right path. In my final year, when I gave my first simulated oral argument before the faculty board, some classmates tried to sabotage me. They made crude jokes to throw me off. I trembled inside, but I held my gaze steady on the board and spoke for 15 minutes without stuttering once. At the end, while the room still laughed, one professor said, "Maybe this girl will go further than you think." It didn't erase the humiliations, but it was like a breath of air after years of drowning. On graduation day, while others celebrated in fancy halls with champagne, I took the bus home, clutching my diploma to my chest. There was no party, no fireworks, but there was my mother, crying with pride, and my father, who said little but, for the first time, didn't avoid my eyes. I knew the hard part wasn't over. The bar exam still awaited, and the outside world had no mercy for those without last names. But in that moment, holding that diploma, I understood. The dream had not only survived, it had grown, and I made a silent promise. One day, when I step into a real courtroom, no one will laugh at the cleaning lady's daughter. No one will dare call me a maid, an intern, or a lost little girl. The day of my revenge had no date yet, but I was already drafting the sentence. Because those who are born underestimated learn to turn every scar into an argument. And I had many scars. I was already a graduate. The diploma hanging on the wall of my small office was proof that I had crossed the impossible. But for the outside world, that wasn't enough. I was just another young lawyer, without a last name, without contacts, without wealthy clients. My office was really just a rented room at the back of an old building, with peeling walls and the smell of mold. My desk was secondhand. The chair creaked with every move, and the printer only worked when it felt like it. Even so, that space was mine. There, I was a lawyer, even if the world didn't believe it. It was in that setting that I received my first big case. A mid-sized company, tired of being exploited by abusive contracts with giant suppliers. No one wanted to face the opposing lawyers. Everyone said it was a lost cause. But the owner of the company, a simple man, bet on me. Maybe because he saw in my eyes the same stubbornness that kept him fighting every day to keep his business alive. I accepted the case. I spent sleepless nights reviewing clause by clause, reading forgotten case law, underlining every detail that could turn into a loophole. I knew that sooner or later, I would have to face someone big. I just didn't know how big. The first hearing arrived. The courtroom was packed. When I entered wearing my worn but neatly pressed suit, I heard whispers. Who is she? Never seen this lawyer before. And then he appeared. The star lawyer. The man everyone knew for giving TV interviews, writing articles in newspapers, posing in pictures surrounded by the powerful, tall, with carefully combed gray hair, a tailored suit, a Swiss watch worth more than I made in a year. He didn't walk. He paraded. He was the kind of man who believed the world was a stage, and he was the lead actor. When he saw me, his eyes narrowed as if he were looking at a lost child. He walked toward me, smiling with that air of superiority only those who've never been humiliated in life can carry. He stopped in front of my table, placed his hands on the back of the chair, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Are you sure you're in the right room, little girl?" Laughter echoed around. Some journalists scribbled in their notebooks, already predicting the easy headline, "Young lawyer swallowed by legal shark." I didn't answer. I didn't look away. I calmly opened my folder, arranged my papers, and with the same calm I had used on my first day in court, I wrote in the corner of the page, "He called me little girl." Again. Inside, every word from him cut me like a knife. In a flash, I saw my mother on her knees scrubbing floors. I remembered the neighbor saying people like us never win in court. I remembered professors laughing at my accent, classmates looking at me like an intruder. It was as if all my scars had been ripped open at once. But there was something different now. I was no longer the poor student, the invisible intern, the waitress smelling of grease. I was a lawyer. I had a client who trusted me, solid evidence, and a rage I had learned to turn into strategy. He thought he diminished me with that laugh. But what he didn't know was that every time someone tried to crush me, I grew stronger inside. At that moment, looking into his eyes, I knew I would bury this man with his own weapons. After that first encounter, I thought maybe he would be satisfied humiliating me once. But no, for men like him, a joke is never just a joke. It's a method, a way to make sure I stayed in my place, small, discredited, swallowed by the laughter of others. At the next hearing, I had barely sat down when he approached and spoke loudly enough for everyone to hear. "I hope the young lady managed to translate the documents this time. I know how difficult it is for beginners." I knew what he was implying. My English wasn't perfect. I had taught myself with borrowed books and lyrics translated in pencil. I had an accent, yes, but I understood enough to practice law. He, of course, knew that, and used every detail as ammunition. The muffled laughter in the room was always the chorus to his attacks. At the third hearing, he crossed any boundary. I was organizing case files when he slammed a bundle of documents onto my table, hard enough for the papers to scatter across the floor. He looked at me, smiled, and said, "Don't worry, little girl. One day you'll learn how to handle real paperwork." The words landed like a punch. I bent down, picked up the sheets one by one, feeling everyone's eyes pinned on me. Some laughed. Others just stared with pity. None of them intervened. And as if that weren't enough, at the end of that same session, when I tried to present an argument, he interrupted me, raising his hand theatrically. "Objection! She doesn't know what she's talking about. Rookie mistake." The word echoed like a stamp. Rookie, beginner, useless. The judge, complacent, let it pass. The jury, already poisoned by his rhetoric, laughed. I remained silent, steady, jotting down every detail. They were 3 blows, 3 new marks carved into my invisible skin. But instead of destroying me, each of his attacks made me sharper. I didn't respond because I knew. When the right moment came, I wouldn't need to shout. I would only need to show. While he amused himself by belittling me, I studied. I spent nights rereading every line of the contracts, every overlooked clause, every precedent buried in the dustiest corners of the databases. While he relied on charisma, I armed myself with evidence. Since childhood, I had learned that the laughter of others can kill, if you let it. But it can also be the greatest mask. Behind every laugh at my expense, I hid my silence. And behind my silence, a plan was being born. He believed he was crushing me with every hearing. What he didn't know was that with each attack, he gave me exactly what I needed. The certainty that when his downfall came, it would be public and unforgettable. And I promised myself, next time they laugh, it won't be at me. It will be at him. It was after the 3rd humiliation that I realized it wasn't enough to simply endure. If I wanted to survive in the same courtroom as him, I had to turn the game around. The silence that until then had been my only defense began to transform into something new, a plan. I started recording every detail, not just his words, but the time, the tone of voice, the reaction of the audience. I wrote it all in a black notebook, hidden at the bottom of my bag. It was no longer just a diary. It was a file, the file of his downfall. While he trusted in theatrics, I immersed myself in what he despised, the paperwork. I went back to studying like I had in law school, but now with a specific purpose, to find his mistake. I dug through old contracts, read forgotten clauses, researched case law buried in the darkest corners of legal databases. Every night bled into dawn. Fatigue no longer hurt, because my fuel was different now. Vengeance. That's how I found the first cracks. Documents he himself had signed in past cases, contradictory clauses in million-dollar contracts, emails that said one thing while his arguments defended another. The man who thought himself infallible was beginning to look like an actor who trusted too much in charisma and too little in the cold letter of the law. And I knew, in a courtroom, charm may convince for a few minutes, but hard evidence, projected before everyone, kills any performance. By then, I no longer had just one client to defend. I had a personal cause. Every clause I highlighted, every precedent I printed, was like sharpening an invisible blade. I didn't just want to win the case. I wanted to crush his arrogance before the same audience that had always laughed at me. Little by little, I built my dossier. I knew I couldn't attack immediately. I had to wait for the right moment, the bigger stage, the hearing with not only the judge, but also the press, the jury, and, if possible, the oversight of the Bar Association itself. He liked an audience? Perfect. I would make sure his fall had the biggest audience possible. Meanwhile, I endured his jokes. I kept smiling when he called me rookie or little girl. Only now, every time he laughed, I laughed inside too, because I knew I already held in my hands the beginning of the rope that would tighten around his neck. My silence was no longer weakness. It was a trap, and that was how the seed of my vengeance was planted, to use what he despised to destroy him. While he strutted through courtrooms as if they were runways, I spent nights buried in piles of paper. What to him was bureaucracy, to me was ammunition. I read every line with obsession, not just of the current case, but of past lawsuits, old contracts, interviews he had given to newspapers. That's when I found it. A multi-million-dollar contract, signed by him years ago, in which he defended a company similar to my client's. In that contract, there was a clause he had used as the central argument to shield the party he represented. But now, years later, in the current case, he was arguing the exact opposite. And worse, he had also signed documents supporting his new position. It was like watching a magician perform the same trick in opposite directions, believing no one would ever notice. But I noticed. And this time, it wasn't a trick. It was a fatal contradiction, recorded, signed, and sealed with his name. I remember the feeling when I realized it. My eyes raced across the page, my hands trembled. I reread it 3 times to be sure I wasn't imagining things. No, there was no doubt. He had tied himself up in his own arrogance. He had relied so much on charisma, theatrics, and his last name that he hadn't bothered to maintain consistency. There was my weapon, a clause, a signature, a technical detail that might seem too small for most, but before a judge, a jury, and, most importantly, the oversight of the Bar Association, it would be dynamite. At that moment, I understood something important. What for him was just another worthless paper. For me was the sentence of his reputation. He lived on image, on interviews, sound bites, on being called a star lawyer. And I was going to destroy him not with eloquent speeches, but with what he despised most: cold, undeniable fine print. I spent weeks building the strategy. I gathered copies, certifications, dates. I created a timeline showing exactly how he had defended one position and, years later, claimed the opposite. And both times, he had signed the documents. There was no way out, no excuse of error or forgetfulness. It was pure carelessness, pure overconfidence. While I prepared my arsenal, he continued his provocations. At one of the last hearings before the big finale, he interrupted me again. "Objection. This is nonsense. She's just a rookie trying to look smart." The judge smirked, the jury laughed, and I remained silent. But inside, I was smiling too. Not because he had humiliated me again, but because I already knew. Inside my folder was the period at the end of that joke. He thought he controlled the narrative. What he didn't know was that I already held in my hands the contradiction that would flip his story upside down. The trick that had always worked for him was about to be used against him, and I would be the only one applauded in the end. I already had the weapon, the fatal contradiction, his signature, the legal detail that would bring him down in any courtroom. But one piece of evidence wasn't enough. I didn't just want to win the case. I wanted to expose him. I wanted the fall to be public, shameful, definitive, and that's when my plan was born. I found out that the State Bar Association would be doing a surprise inspection in the city in the coming weeks. Normally, lawyers feared this kind of oversight, but no one would suspect if I suggested that the final hearing be scheduled for that date. I argued it was the only available slot, and the judge agreed. The star lawyer, as always, laughed. For him, no date would change the outcome. He believed so much in his own shine that he didn't realize he was walking straight into my trap. While he rehearsed sound bites in front of the mirror, I built my dossier. Every document had a colored marker, every date a precise note. I created a clear, irrefutable timeline, ready to be projected for all to see. It wasn't just about winning. It was about crushing his image with evidence so cold there would be no room for dramatic reactions. And I didn't stop there. I anonymously leaked a few excerpts of the case to local journalists. Small teasers, just enough to stir curiosity. I knew that if the press was present in the courtroom, every word he spoke, every gesture, every slip-up would be recorded. He loved cameras. This time they would be the witnesses of his ruin. In the days leading up to the hearing, I didn't sleep. I reviewed every detail 1,000 times. I paced the room with papers in hand, like an actress rehearsing for opening night. Only my stage wasn't a theater. It was the courtroom, and my audience would be a jury, journalists, and Bar Association inspectors. When the day arrived, I wore my simple suit. But this time I walked into the courthouse knowing I wasn't stepping in as a victim. I was stepping in as an executioner. The courtroom was packed. I recognized the journalists in the front rows. I also saw 3 bar inspectors sitting discreetly in the back, ready to observe. He entered a few minutes later, radiating charisma. He smiled at everyone, shook hands firmly, cracked jokes to ease the jury. He acted as always, the star of the show. But for the first time, I felt no anger, no fear, only calm, because I knew something he didn't. Every word he uttered that day would be measured not by charm, but by the cold yardstick of the evidence I carried. When the judge opened the session, he began with his brilliant oratory. He used metaphors, stories, made the jury laugh, waved his arms as if on a stage. I observed in silence, letting his confidence swell like a balloon about to burst. And when my turn came, I simply opened my folder, raised the first document, and said, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not about stories. This is about facts. And the facts are written here by his own hand." Silence fell. The stage was mine. The trap was set, and he had walked right into it without realizing. My heart pounded like a drum, but my voice came out steady. I knew I couldn't falter. One shaky word, one misplaced gesture, and everyone would say I was just a lost little girl pretending to be a lawyer. So I held the folder tightly, raised the first document, and took a deep breath. This contract here, signed in 2016, shows the defense he used to shield his client. At that time, Clause 8.3 was considered essential to validate the operation. I projected the image onto the courtroom screen. The old document appeared enlarged, his signature highlighted. The jury leaned forward, curious. Some journalists already had their pens raised, attentive. I continued. Now, this other contract signed in 2020 shows the same lawyer defending the opposing side and using the opposite argument, and more, with the same signature, on the same type of clause. I projected the second document. It was like holding up a mirror to the audience. The contrast was glaring. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. I glanced at him. For the first time, the theatrical smile was gone. He shifted in his chair, adjusted his tie, cleared his throat. He tried to look confident, but the flush rising in his face betrayed his discomfort. I went on, cold, unhurried. And so there is no doubt this isn't a mere interpretation. Here are the emails he himself sent, reinforcing the contradiction. One says Clause 8.3 must be considered mandatory. The other, years later, Clause 8.3 cannot be applied under any circumstance. I projected the emails. The room went silent. A heavy, dense silence, the kind that comes right before an explosion. And then I heard it. A muffled laugh. Not at me, at him. One of the jurors couldn't hide it. The journalists exchanged glances as if saying, "This will make headlines." He tried to react. He stood up with his usual tone, gesturing. "Your Honor, this is irrelevant. These are different cases with different contexts. This young lady is simply confused." But his voice faltered. He stammered. For the first time, the man who always controlled the rhythm of the room lost his pace. The judge raised his hand, calling for order. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The entire courtroom had seen it. The star lawyer was stumbling, and I knew this was only the beginning. I had much more in store. The first impact had been struck. The giant had cracked. Now it was only a matter of pushing until he collapsed completely. The entire courtroom held its breath. I felt the heavy silence, as if everyone expected me to stop, as if I had already exhausted my arsenal. But I hadn't even started. I opened the second folder, thicker, filled with documents. I walked to the projector and began displaying the pieces I had saved as ammunition, one by one. Here is the timeline. Signatures, dates, clauses. In 2016, he defended A. In 2020, he defended B. Clear contradictions. Not merely interpretive, but legal positions. The same lawyer, the same signature, the same clause number, 2 opposing arguments. I projected the charts I had prepared. Colorful, organized, simple enough for any juror to understand. I saw wide eyes on the jury. I saw journalists exchanging glances, already imagining tomorrow's headline. On the other side, he tried to react, adjusting his tie, tapping his pen, crossing and uncrossing his legs, but each gesture betrayed his nerves. With every document I displayed, His face lost more color. I pressed on. Internal emails, gentlemen. Emails sent by the lawyer himself, reinforcing his thesis in one case and denying the same thesis in another. Two incompatible arguments. Two truths that cannot coexist. I projected the emails. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. It was undeniable. There it was, black and white. Proof that the man who sold himself as an icon of consistency was, in practice, a contradictory actor. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. It was the Bar Association inspectors. They didn't intervene, only took notes in their notebooks. But their presence alone, witnessing, was enough to make it clear this wouldn't end with just a courtroom defeat. This was already disciplinary matter. I looked at him. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. Not anger, not arrogance. Fear. He knew. He knew he couldn't defend himself against his own signature. He knew no pretty speech, no joke, no irony would erase what was projected for everyone to see. He tried one last card. He stood and said, "This is out of context. She is misleading you all. I have served this profession for decades. Are you going to believe a rookie?" But the word came out weak, without echo. No one laughed. Not the jury, not the judge, not the journalists. Even his own assistants lowered their eyes in embarrassment. I simply took a deep breath, looked at the judge, and concluded, this is not about me being young or him being famous. This is about truth, and the truth is written in his own words, with his own hand. Silence. A deafening silence. And then, the impossible happened. One of the jurors shook his head in disapproval. Journalists began typing furiously. The entire courtroom had turned against him. Right there, before everyone, the myth began to crumble. I no longer needed to prove anything about myself. He had destroyed himself. I had only turned on the light. When I finished my presentation, the silence in the courtroom was almost tangible. I felt the heavy air, as if everyone were still processing what they had just heard. For the first time, no one laughed. There were no jokes, no looks of disdain aimed at me. All eyes were on him. The judge cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and said calmly, "The evidence is clear. This court rules in favor of the plaintiff." It was as if thunder had struck inside the room. The case was decided. I had won. For a moment, I stood still. Not because I doubted the victory, but because my body couldn't believe it. Years of struggle, humiliation, muffled laughter, everything culminated right there, in that simple sentence from the judge. I had defeated the star lawyer. I, the cleaning lady's daughter, the waitress who studied on crowded buses, the intern who served coffee at meetings. I had won. But his fall wasn't over yet. His client, a wealthy and arrogant businessman, rose from the front row and right there in open court declared, "You humiliated me. You promised results, and now I'm the one who lost millions because of your incompetence. We're done." The star lawyer's face turned red, then pale. He tried to respond, but no sound came out. The businessman turned his back and walked out of the courtroom in front of the cameras, making it clear to everyone that their partnership was over. The journalists didn't waste a second. The cameras swung toward him. Flashes went off. Questions rained down. Did you contradict yourself intentionally? Are you afraid of being investigated by the Bar Association? How do you explain these inconsistencies? He tried to walk, but the reporters surrounded him. His once firm, theatrical posture now looked clumsy. The man who had loved the spotlight now seemed crushed by it. And that's when I realized the verdict had given me victory, but the public exposure was the true punishment. He hadn't just lost a case. He had lost respect. The image of invincibility, built over decades, collapsed in a matter of minutes. While he sweated under the cameras, I calmly placed my papers back into my folder. I didn't need to say a word. My silence now spoke louder than any speech. I knew that, at that very moment, every journalist was writing the same headline: "Young lawyer defeats legal icon." He had tried to reduce me to a lost little girl, but now he was the one who looked lost, cornered, with no way out. I walked out of the courtroom with my head held high. There were no cheers, no celebration, but there were looks. Looks of respect, of surprise, of recognition, and above all, there was his gaze. Empty, defeated. The fall had been public, and there was no turning back. Many people believed my victory was luck, that I just happened to find the right contradiction at the right time. But I know, and now everyone knows, that there was no chance involved in his downfall. From the beginning, I planned every step. I knew it wasn't enough to beat him on legal merit. If it were only that, he'd give an interview the next day, invent some excuse, and still be the star lawyer in the public eye. No, I needed the truth to be inescapable, official, recorded. That's why I chose the date of the final hearing so carefully. I knew, through discreet contacts and relentless research, that the State Bar Association would be conducting inspections that week. I adjusted my motion to push the schedule exactly to that date, and when the judge confirmed it, I kept my smile to myself. When he walked into the courtroom, thinking it was just another show with a guaranteed audience, he didn't notice the inspectors sitting in the back rows. They weren't just spectators. They were hidden judges, ready to note every word, and every joke he made at my expense, every interruption, every needless attack. All of it was recorded, not by me, but by them. I no longer needed to write in my black notebook, as I had since law school. This time, the ones writing were the very people who would decide the future of his license to practice law. The press played its part, of course. The headlines spread faster than I could imagine. Young lawyer buries legal icon. Star attorney exposed for contradictions. But the real blow didn't come from the newspapers. It came from the letter the Bar Association sent a few days later, announcing the opening of a disciplinary proceeding. That's when the joke ended. The man who once called me a lost little girl now had to defend himself, not from me, but from the very institution that regulated his career. His colleagues avoided him, clients began dropping contracts, his reputation collapsed like a house of cards. I watched it all in silence. There was no need to celebrate out loud. My victory was already written in every place that mattered. In the headlines, in the bar reports, in the eyes that now saw me not as an intruder, but as a lawyer. And inside me, the promise I made years ago, in that damp basement where I studied by candlelight, surrounded by laughter and mockery, was finally fulfilled. He tried to reduce me to nothing, but I used every scar as a step, and in the end, when the truth came out, he was the one who got lost. He tried to make me small. I buried him with every scar he gave me.